Okay, so welcome to our survey of Jewish storytelling class. And I'm excited to share with you some of the things that I've learned over the course of my education and just some interesting facts and things that I think will really open up some of the texts for you. So we're going to start actually with uh, something that is traditional to do at this time of year, which is counting the Omer. So I want to share with you, if you can see the screen here. This is, the next page I'll show you the book that it's from, but I want to have options here. So we'll do it first with the traditional text, and then we'll also do the variation with feminine God language in case that appeals to you as well. So I'll just lead us in the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu al sfirat haomer. And then Brucha atiyah shechina Eloheinu ruach haolam, asher kidshatnu b'mitzvoteha etzivanu al sfirat haomer. Hayom yom shisha asar laomer. Today is the 16th day of the Omer, and making 2 weeks and 2 days of the Omer. So counting of the Omer is actually a very traditional thing to do, not something that I personally incorporated into my practice until last year, because it can be very difficult to remember to count every night. But something that I found really helped me in this practice is actually kind of related to this class, which is I found this book called Toward Sinai, Omer Poems, and it has a different poem for every day of the Omer. So it kind of gives me something to look forward to, some interesting language to just kind of connect spiritually to the practice. So I'm going to go ahead and read tonight's entry for day 16. Already here. How much of your life will you spend seeking shoes, hunting the keys you're certain you left in a pocket, sunglasses resting unnoticed on top of your head? Meanwhile, the Holy One hides in plain sight. Practice moderation, even in your boot rack. Let habit guide you to glide through routine, scuff on your sandals while ice rattles in your glass. With the minutes you glean, say thanks for the big bang still unfolding. Pedestrians carry bright umbrellas like nodding tulips. Thread a path between puddles. Balance kindness and determination. Everything else is commentary. If you can't find your shoes, then go barefoot. Push your cart through the cluttered aisles. Don't forget the intangibles. How will you nourish the part of you that thrives not on bread, but on song? The sages say what you're seeking is already here. 2 weeks and 2 days of the Omer. I just think it's really beautiful to be able to share poetry like that. So if you're interested in that book, let me know and I can send the info to you. But I think it's a really great way to incorporate this practice because it can be difficult to connect to sometimes. And so that kind of brings us into the storytelling aspect. So I'm going to go ahead and share with you a PowerPoint presentation and we'll kind of make our way through it. If at any point you have questions or you want to add to the discussion, I'll sort of let you know when there are moments if I'm going to ask questions or if you want to add to it. I'll sort of let you know when those moments are, but feel free to also use the raise hand function or if I don't notice you, you feel free to unmute and let me know. One moment here. Okay. Oh, there's Jill. Okay. So, Jill, let me also make you a co-host, so in case you need that. Okay. So, a survey in Jewish storytelling from biblical times to the modern era. This is part 1 of 2. So this is a 2-series class. Obviously, if you're encompassing this large of a period of time, it's difficult to encapsulate that all within one class period. So this part 1 aspect is going to really deal more with the biblical times part of it and like the older times. So first, we have to talk about what is storytelling. And I'm going to go through the bullet points that I listed, but it's not by any means an exhaustive list. So, you know, if you want to sort of add to that, feel free to do that. So I would say it's use of language and nuance within that, sharing rather than merely communicating. It can be through a variety of media, spoken, written, sung, enacted, visual, etc. And here's the important thing. I think this is really the essence of the human experience. I mentioned before, sharing rather than merely communicating. If you think about any other species, um, they do communicate with each other, right? Most of the things that they communicate, as far as we know, are things related to mating and food, sort of their baseline of their hierarchy of needs, right? But our hierarchy of needs also involves community, also involves art, also involves belonging, and so many other things. I think because of that, and sort of just the way we have developed as a species, we have more than just those needs, and this is something that we do. Storytelling is really crucial to being human. This is important. Life lessons we learn through things we ourselves may not have personally experienced, but can still relate to. How many times have you read or listened to a story that is nothing like your life at all, but you can still understand what's going on and you can still find ways to resonate with that? This is a really interesting quote. Storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it. And that's a quote by Hannah Arendt, who is certainly a well-known author. So I'm going to talk about what stories do we tell. Like I said, this is not an exhaustive list. So if you want to sort of add to that, please feel free to do so, especially in this component, because there might be more things that you can think of. Starting out right off the bat, stories of creation and religion to help explain how we got here and what principles to live by. That's certainly a familiar aspect to the stories that we tell. Parables to teach us some of life's important truths. Stories of drama, illustrating the vast breadth of human emotion, such as love, joy, despair, longing, confusion, etc. Exercises in imagination, philosophy, and morality. Those are some of the stories that we tell. Does anyone want to add anything that wasn't in that list? Like I said, it's certainly not an exhaustive list. There are definitely more stories than just that, but these are just sort of what I came up with just to sort of illustrate, what are these stories? Because like I said, it encompasses all of human history, basically. So yeah, Jill, did you want to add something?
Yeah, it's really funny. Hi, Cantor. I
Hi.
apologize so much for being late. I was preparing a lecture today on narrative analysis, and it's so interesting that you're talking about this. And so I would say add to this, because narrative analysis is actually a form of analyzing people's stories to make
Absolutely.
meaning. And
Yes.
that's what I was thinking of. What do stories tell us? They tell us the meaning, by looking at stories and the common sort of threads in those stories, we can make meaning out of certain experiences.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. I think that's a wonderful way to put it. Anybody else have anything else to add? What stories do we tell? Yeah, Seth. Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Here we go. There's I guess I want to say traditional, that's probably not the right term, set of classifications, and all stories fall into one of these categories. And then it depends on how you count. But it's like, I'll try to use egalitarian language here and say people rather than man.
Right.
But, people versus nature, people.
Oh, yes.
So,
Yeah.
I'm not sure how that fits into here, or if it's a distraction. I should.
No, it fits into there for sure. It does. It was also what man versus man, man versus
man versus man,
community.
man versus nature, man versus
I think was it community?
man versus machine. I think they've come up with more recently.
Nowadays, sure. You wouldn't have seen that way back, but you see it now, sure.
And so one person versus many,
Yes.
community or whatever would be, would collapse into person versus person.
Sure. and this sort of also feeds into the fact that in terms of storytelling, that if you look throughout the, thousands of years, many millennia of human history, you will find a very vast and diverse array of stories, but a lot of them do have tropes. And I'm not talking about Torah and Haftarah trope or anything like that. I'm talking about the tropes of storytelling, right? If you look at, like, I mean, I'm certainly a fan of the fantasy genre, and you see a lot of the fantasy genres have certain common threads of, the hero's reluctant hero's journey. If you look at, well, actually, J.K. Rowling took some of those tropes even from Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien. So, some of these things are very old and have been around a long time. Epic of Gilgamesh is also, a very old story. So, we're certainly not the only ones who tell stories, and we're not even the oldest necessarily society to do that. We just have some of the oldest forms of storytelling that kind of we still relate to today. So moving on, storytelling and Judaism. So from the very beginning of our peoplehood all the way through today, stories have shaped and defined us, absolutely. And storytelling isn't just the stories themselves, it's also the art forms used to express them, which is also what we're going to delve into today. I also wanted to mention, this is a very interesting fact I'm not sure many of you necessarily know. So there's a reason that Hebrew uses the same word for song as for poem. That word is shir. The two ideas are inherently connected. And whether it's actually sung or not, a poem can still be considered a song. Music is a big part of Jewish storytelling, and we may not know, it's very difficult to actually know what melodies were used back then. And we have something called Sinai melodies, right? But in reality, we can't really trace melodies that far back. We like to think that we can, but certainly in reading the texts that those melodies were set to, we have some idea of what's being expressed, and we can try to imagine or reimagine the melodies with that. But we do know that there were melodies, and at the very least, the language is melodic for poetry, even if it's not actually set to music. So I think it's a very interesting connection that the word is the same, shir, no matter if it's a poem or a song. I want to talk about the early forms of Jewish storytelling during today's session. So first of all, starting with Torah, which literally means teaching or instruction. So this includes the 5 books. Does anybody want to give us the list of the 5 books? Anybody? Oh, come on, I know you guys know this one. Feel free to, if you know it, just unmute and say it.
Bereshit, Shmot,
Vayikra.
Vayikra. I'm stuck. Thank you. I'm stuck on the Hebrew names.
Well, you can say it in English too. That's the way most people know it.
Deuteronomy.
Yes. So Bereshit, Genesis, Shmot, Exodus, Leviticus, Vayikra. We've got Bamidbar, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Devarim. Those actually, by the way, the English names that I used are, well, they're not technically English all the way. Some of them are kind of Greek. But the Hebrew meaning is also different. So we have Bereshit means in the beginning. We have Shmot means names. We have Vayikra, and he called out. Bamidbar, in the desert or in the wilderness. And Devarim, things or words. Also, the word for word and thing is davar. It's the same word or thing. So that's also known as the Pentateuch, which is also a Greek-derived word. Then we have Nevi'im, prophets. So this includes books like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jonah. There's lots of prophets beyond those. But those are some of the main ones you might know. Ketuvim, writings. This includes anything canonized through around the 2nd century of the Common Era that isn't part of Torah or Nevi'im, so such as Kohelet, which is Ecclesiastes, Job, Eicha, which is Lamentations, Esther, Ruth, Tehillim, Psalms, which we're going to talk about a lot today, Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, Mishlei, Proverbs, etc. So it really is kind of an all-encompassing book. But if you take these letters together, the Hebrew letters together, they form the word Tanakh. So Tanakh is an acronym that we use for all of these collections of writings that were canonized, like I said, by the 2nd century CE. And these are told through prose, poetry, and song. I also want to mention Talmud, and if we have time today, I think we'll get into a little bit of that as well. So Talmud, by the way, similar to Torah. Torah means teaching, instruction. Talmud means study, but it also can mean instruction. So this consists of the Mishnah and the Gemara, which are basically the oral tradition that were, sort of later laid out. Obviously, they are written nowadays, although the oral tradition remains strong as well with these. So they're central texts of rabbinic Judaism that were codified by around 500 CE, relating the laws, theology, arguments, etc., that all have to do with Judaism and also with Tanakh. So they deal with a lot of different things. So I want to talk about the earliest mentions of songs. So first of all, there was Yuval, one of the descendants of Cain, was specifically mentioned as being the father of all who play the harp and lute. This was way back in Genesis chapter 4, verse 21. So that's very early in the text. That song was specifically mentioned. And we don't know if it was Yuval himself or his children or possibly both. And we don't know what sort of music they would have played. But I think it's probably fair to say that it was joyous, since his name is also the root of the words jubilee and jubilation, which are indicative of joyous song. But I think it's also worth noting that Yuval and his descendants did not survive the flood, right? Because they were descendants of Cain, and we know it was the descendants of Seth, who were Noah and his descendants, right? So it's interesting that we have all the names of descendants of Cain who did not survive the flood, and we know about a little bit about their personalities and sort of the things that they did. We have another of Cain's descendants was mentioned as being like a carpenter, a craftsman. So it's very interesting that these things are preserved. We don't know. I don't think it's possible to necessarily trace the exact lineage that far back in human history, if it's true or not, but if it is, it's pretty fascinating that far down the generations and centuries that we would still know about someone from another line of ancestry that isn't in existence anymore, famous for their songs. I find that pretty fascinating. And then, of course, this one's going to be well known to many of you. The very first song lyrics specifically referenced to as such were Shirat Hayam, so the Song of the Sea, Exodus chapter 15, verses 1 through 18, a joyous song of redemption upon escaping slavery in Egypt and safely crossing the Sea of Reeds. And that was also built into our everyday liturgy, right? So this is referenced every day in Judaism, is this song. And it has its own, interestingly, it has trope, but it also has its own melody that people use that's a little bit separate from that. So it's a very special song. And like I said, we don't know what melody was used, but we do know that it's a song and it's actually something that was sung. So now I want to talk about playing with language. If you don't already know this, Hebrew words derive their primary meanings from the shoresh of the word. So that's typically 3, although sometimes arguably 2 or 4 in the case of a geminate root, which is doubled. Root letters that are mixed with different verb or noun forms and prefixes and suffixes to form the overall meaning. So, when you're looking at a Hebrew word, if you know enough about the grammar and sort of the way everything is built, you can sort of know what the shoresh is, and you can see how everything is built. There are many examples throughout our oldest texts that show a sort of playfulness with the manipulations of these words and an awareness of the way the sounds enhance the storytelling aspect. Assonance and alliteration play a role in the Tanakh, right? So assonance being similar vowel sounds, and alliteration, of course, being similar consonantal sounds grouped together. So those definitely do exist in the Tanakh. So these are some of the forms of poetry, of storytelling that we know in today's context as well. the names of characters in the Torah often mean something significant to the nature of who they are. And also, it's worth noting that there are multiple mentions of name changes when something also significant happens in their stories, right? We know Avram and Sarai became Avraham and Sarah. And we also know Yaakov became Yisrael, although he used both names sort of interchangeably, right? But Yisrael then became our name as a nation, right? The ones who wrestle with the divine, from that story that Jacob literally wrestled with an angel or with God or whatever mysterious figure it was. So I'm going to give some examples here. The first three words of the Torah are Bereshit bara Elokim. I'm saying Elokim. It's actually a hey, but there's a tradition of trying to preserve the one of God's holy names, so I'll put the kuf in there instead. So Bereshit bara Elokim, meaning in the beginning God created. So the shoresh for the first word is Resh Aleph Shin, meaning head or top. Think of Rosh Hashanah, right? The head of the year, the top of the year. And the prefix letter bet is used to mean in. It's a preposition, right? So even though that bet is not part of the shoresh for the word, for the second word bara, bet resh aleph, meaning created, they share the same first three letters. So I think that's kind of interesting that they have that connection, that creative element. So maybe if you were going to do a sort of a look at some of the shorashim of Hebrew words, maybe you might find that there's something specific to the letters Resh and Aleph that have to do with creation, because the beginning and created, like the creative element of having a beginning, like there might be something to that. So there's probably studies out there, but it's an interesting confluence. Another example is the name for Hebrew is Ivrit, and the shorish for this word is ayin vet resh, which means to pass or cross over. And this is quite literal because Abraham made a trek into the land of Canaan to establish our people there. And of course, we know that this people and language have passed through many lands in the face of persecution as well. Various changes in the shorish can also indicate the past, avar, right? Transfer and transgress, for example. And it's also interesting that Avraham, his name also, I mean, if you look at the way it's spelled, though, Ayin and Aleph, they both are the silent letters. Maybe originally they weren't. They might have sounded differently, different from each other way back when. But it almost seems like there's also a connection between Avraham and Ivrit, right? Because he also was the one who crossed over. Do you have a question, Renee? Oh, please unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, now you are.
So I know that with the ayin for Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, for example, in Israel, older generations, that they pronounce it in a much different way than the Ashkenazi Jews.
Yes. So
what's the significance of that?
Languages shift over time, and if you think about the fact that we have classification, Jews who stayed in the Middle East area or who went, Sephardic Jews in this area of Spain, that they might have preserved different versions of the language that, it's kind of like the language branched out when the people branched out. So they were still speaking their language, but they're going to go through their own separate changes in separate lands, if you think of it that way. So that is something that can happen sometimes. I have a friend whose husband is Egyptian Jewish, and both of them actually sort of adopted a little bit of that pronunciation. So sometimes I hear some of that pronunciation, like I've heard her Lane Torah, and it's very interesting to see that. But technically speaking, a lot of the letters that sound the same in Hebrew today historically would not have sounded the same. So there's a reason that they're spelled differently, and the shorish is different, but there might be some significance to similar sounds or similar placement in terms of how things are pronounced. Any other questions about that? There are times when Hebrew even makes wordplay with other languages that would have been known to the people reading or listening. So languages such, well, certainly we know there's a lot of crossover with Aramaic, which was a very commonly spoken language back then. There are even still native Aramaic speakers today, although not very many. But that was sort of the lingua franca for a very, very long time in the Middle East. And Greek certainly was also a very commonly spoken language. Akkadian, so other Semitic languages too. So sometimes there were sort of oblique references to other interpretations that shared cognates basically within languages. So getting to Torah, we do have set cycles determining when to read different parts of the Torah, as well as other readings that accompany particular holidays. And the Torah was likely codified circa 450 to 350 BCE, and to our knowledge, hasn't changed since then. So why keep reading the same text every week, every year, if it hasn't changed? This can be rhetorical. If you wanna unmute and say something to that, feel free to do that. Yeah, Renee?
Maybe it's because, well, I know that, it's very circular in the sense that when it's Rosh Hashanah, we have a round challah to symbolize
Oh, sure.
circular. And so when you begin and end, it ends up being like a loop that you restarted. And maybe through doing that, you gain a deeper and deeper understanding as the years go by.
Yes.
Interpretations.
Very nice. Yes, Maggie, what were you going to say? We change. We do, absolutely. I mean, have any of you ever reread a book after many years not having read it? Right? And sometimes that can open up the story to you in a whole new way. I'll give an example, not even from reading, but actually when I a few months back when I saw West Side Story, the remake, completely changed my perception of the story from the original movie version that I saw when I was a kid, right? I didn't have the same perspective. I mean, the story was told in a different way, but I also have changed since I last looked at that story, and I completely saw it in a new way. Yeah, Jill.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking this question, Cantor. And I when you put it up there, I thought, yeah, why do we? That's such an interesting question. I'm so glad to listen to your answers. And I love your example of West Side Story. I was at the Huntington Gardens today, and I was telling a friend of mine that, okay, you're going to think this is silly, but the movie The American President with Michael Douglas and Annette Bening, that's one of my favorite movies. And I probably have watched it like 10 times. And, when I first watched it, it was just a really nice romantic comedy, and where's my Michael Douglas and all that stuff, and then, it took on a whole new meaning when we went through that, horrible, elections and all this stuff. And Michael Douglas has this great speech at the end, that I was like, looked at, when was the movie made? And I was shocked, oh my gosh, it's like it could have been made like today, so like I really like that you both shared that, and you, Maggie, about like, why do we keep reading it? Because you're right, because we get older, but the context of the world in which we're living in changes as well. I mean, I have to say that, the songs that, similar to this, the songs that you sing, at our service, all through COVID, and I think I mentioned this once before, they kept me going at night, your nighttime, prayer, I would listen to it, and, did I have that kind of attachment to it before COVID? Probably not. So I think as the world changes and we change, we probably do. And sometimes when you read something once, then when you read it again, you see something in it you didn't see, like you said, the first time.
Or maybe you weren't ready for it the first time you read it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up.
Tina.
Yeah, for me, when you just talking about a book you read years ago and you reread it, for me, it was definitely To Kill a Mockingbird, when I read it younger, growing up in Michigan. And then I reread it when my girls were reading it in school. And of course, they grew up in California. And it's very different growing up in the Midwest versus the West Coast.
I'm
And
aware.
I'm, we moved out here, we were still pretty young, 23, 24. So I would still say those were very formidable years for my husband and I. And but watching my girls grow up in a very diverse, community versus where I grew up in Michigan, it was completely different. And then the other book, when I read in college, which was The Handmaid's Tale. And I reread that a couple years ago, and very different viewpoint, especially what was going on in the world with our administration, a few years ago. Reading that book, if anyone's read it, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So,
And then also that's it's maybe not a coincidence that the TV series came out too. It's very timely.
exactly.
Yeah. So we're going to move on. Most of the text in the Tanakh has trope symbols built in to indicate pronunciation and inflection while singing. This aids in the storytelling form. These symbols were gradually codified since the medieval periods, right? So that came a lot later, although there certainly were some sort of cantillation methods that probably existed from way back when. If you imagine someone just droning in a monotone, you're not going to be interested to hear what they have to say. So of course it was important for it to be chanted in a way that made the story come to life and be interesting to hear. But the version that we have today is pretty old. I mean, the medieval period was not a short time ago. It was quite a long time ago for us. But maybe in the course of Jewish history, it also wasn't that long. It wasn't that long ago. So something to be aware of. Poetic forms we're going to get into now. So acrostics, which I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with. It might be one of the earliest poetic forms that I can remember learning as a kid. Maybe if you don't know the name acrostic, but you might recognize the form if I explain it. So acrostics are here with Hebrew, of course, it's the alphabet, but the alphabet, right? Using that to encode hidden meanings, such as the name of the author, or going forwards and backwards in the alphabet, sometimes in doubles to highlight special meaning. So the first letter of basically the verse is gonna be like Aleph, and then the first letter of the second verse is gonna be Bet, or whatever it spells out. There's a significance to that. So I remember when I was like a little kid, we would make acrostics of our own names and like use, adjectives to describe ourselves or write a sentence. And it was always difficult with the letter Y, or if anybody had difficult letters, like if you have an X in your name or something like that, kind of hard to do. But you get the idea. So that's acrostics. And this is a very old form that we still use today. Parallelism. So parallelism is repeating a phrase that was just said in reworded form to emphasize meaning. So if you think about he neither sleeps nor slumbers, right? Sleep and slumber, they basically mean the same thing, but you say it twice and that sort of emphasizes the meaning. So both of these have asterisks because we're going to delve a little bit more into them when we have some more examples. I want to talk about, certainly rhythm is important. So how the cadence of the spoken words contributes to one's perception of them, but we are going to primarily delve into the text with English. So it doesn't necessarily apply the same way if you're looking at a translation. Just know that if you ever want to further engage with this in the Hebrew form of it, rhythm is certainly a big part of that. And then of course, formatting. So sometimes there are anomalies in formatting that indicate deeper meanings. Certainly in the Torah, if you think about spots where there's space, I know Rabbi has certainly pointed out times where we have in Shirat Hayam, where we have it's like the divisions of like how the sea was split, or if you look at the way the 10 Commandments are laid out. So sometimes that formatting is special to really indicate how important that text is. And of course, that's also something that carries over into today. If you look at how a poem is composed, the formatting can help make things more interesting and deepen your experience of it. So I want to talk about Psalms, and the primary types of Psalms are praise, lamentation, thanksgiving, and ancillary, also wisdom. It sort of depends on how you categorize them. Some of them can fall into multiple categories, and there might even be some other more minor categories beyond this, but these are the ones we'll talk about today. There are 150 in total, and you probably have heard many versions of Psalm 150 before because it's one of our most popular ones. So all the Psalms are typically attributed to King David, who was known as a musician and poet. although we can't specifically point to the exact authorship, by the way. Many contain, and I would say not even just many, but I would think almost all of them actually have superscripts. So some of which are difficult to precisely decipher, but it is probable that many of these refer to instructions for how they are to be sung by the Levitical choirs. Tehillim psalms are absolutely understood to be sung. And some of them have instances of what's called Hapax legomenon, which is a phrase that really only occurs sort of once, or in only in one context in the Tanakh, which means it's difficult or maybe impossible to precisely decipher its meaning if that's the only instance you see it in. So you can't take it in another context and then use that to decipher what it means. It's only in that context. But we know sort of that a lot of them are basically, maybe this is the type of song that it is, or instructions to the leader. Some of them say that. So just so you know, you're going to encounter those when you read Tehillim. It's traditional to recite these in times of great tragedy or stress or need. Certainly you hear among traditional communities that, oh, I'll recite Tehillim for him, or, if someone's going through illness or just, a tragedy in your life, they can bring a lot of comfort. So I wanted to start off by using this example here. Let me see. I wonder if I can use the whiteboard here. Let's see if we can get this to work. Maybe not. I'm not seeing a whiteboard, so okay. But you can see this. Maybe some of you might recognize. Do you recognize the prayer that we say some of these words from? Does anybody recognize these words? Granted, it has only the translation in the Hebrew. It doesn't have the transliteration, but it says, Tehilat leDavid, Armimcha Elohai HaMelech, V'avarcha Shimcha le'olam va'ed, V'chol yom avarcheka v'hala Shimcha le'olam va'ed. Right? Does anybody recognize what prayer this comes from?
Is anything from the Kaddish?
Not the Kaddish prayer, although that's a good guess. It is, but it is. Let's say this prayer is traditionally said 3 times a day, although it's actually not said at each service. It's actually said once in the morning and twice in the afternoon. Has anybody ever heard of Ashrei, the Ashrei prayer? Ashrei Yoshvei V'techa Od Yahalu Chasel. So that prayer, it doesn't have the Ashrei part in it, but basically that prayer is just an amalgamation of different psalms. And the primary psalm that is in its entirety in that prayer is Psalm 145. And does anybody recognize which of the poetical forms I mentioned earlier is in here? You want to give an example if you see one?
Yeah, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey.
There you see. All right. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin. I cut it off. I didn't go through the whole thing, but it's enough to show you that it's an acrostic poem. Does anybody see anything else that we talked about?
Yeah, you have a lot of double things like gracious, and they sort of are the same, not really,
Yes.
but gracious.
Okay, so can someone point out an example to me of the parallelism we talked about? Point out a direct example in the English. You can just pick one, and how is it a parallelism?
Well, I guess you could say, like, looking at the first 2 stanzas,
Yeah,
one is bless your name forever and ever.
praise, bless,
and
and
then
praise.
praise
Yeah.
your name forever and ever. So
Mhm.
there's some parallelism there.
Yes. Great and much acclaimed. God's greatness cannot be fathomed, right? So yeah, basically almost every single one of these stanzas has a parallelism in it. And like once you are familiar with the forms, you're basically going to see them in almost everything. Kathy, I finally saw your post in the chat. Shalshelet, yes, that is one of the tropes that comes up, I think only 3 times, or maybe it's 4, in the entirety of the Tanakh. And it certainly denotes a very dramatic moment when it's being read. The one that comes to mind is in the story when Joseph is in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife is attempting to seduce him, right? And Joseph says no, right? So if you think about the drama of that moment, probably it was very difficult for him to say no to something like that, right? And that no, that resounding no. So yeah, so certainly, like I said, it definitely, the trope definitely serves the text. So this is anyway an example of a praise psalm, and it's integrated into our liturgy. So we're going to move on. I want to talk about the Talmud a little bit. So some people spend an entire lifetime studying Talmud and may still not consider themselves experts. Okay, so this is not your run-of-the-mill bit of study, and it takes a lot to delve into it, and especially if you're going to delve into it from the Hebrew, and you might need to learn to read like the Rashi script or other things like that. Justin, I'm seeing your question. Why do we not use the Tamim in the Psalms while we do when we learn Torah? That's an interesting question. So, I think some people maybe could integrate the tropes when they read Psalms, I suppose. I haven't really heard it done. But if you think about it, the tropes came much, much later than the actual text of the Psalms. So it's sort of not anachronistic exactly, but if you think about it, any melody that we put to any of the Psalms today could still hold about as much meaning if it's done well as any of the tamim, any of the tropes in there. So I hope that answers your question. But getting back to the Talmud, so the Talmud is primarily comprised of legal arguments to determine the halacha, right? The halacha is sort of the way of Jewish life, interpreting the laws of Jewish life. It often goes into a lot of tangential arguments and stories and a lot of hypotheticals. And to be honest, some of them really do border on ridiculous. Some of those hypotheticals that they go into. But if you think about it, this was a very particular time in Jewish history, and I think they were trying to make interpretations that could hold for generations to come, and some of them do, and some of them are also difficult to understand today. It preserves all sides of an argument, even if it is determined that that side is incorrect. So it's very interesting. I don't know if you see a lot of cultures do that. If you think about storytelling, they preserve the elements of truth. If you depending on what side of the story you hear. So this tells you all the sides of the story, and then it even tells you if it's wrong, but they still tell you that side of the story. I think it's very interesting that they do that. And I think a lot of our sort of identity as the Jewish people and the people of the book might kind of come from this. So even if you haven't studied Talmud extensively, I think an understanding of that might have sort of filtered its way through, because we like to argue, we like to question things. And I think that's a really integral part of who we are as a people. Does anyone have anything to add about this? Okay, so I want to go into an example, and this is one of the first Talmud stories that I learned when I've studied a little bit of Talmud, and I think it's a nice way to delve in without getting too deep, without getting caught in the mires, because I think it can be difficult to do, or easy to get caught in the mires, should I say. I'm gonna, this is part one of it. It continues on to the next page. Does somebody want to volunteer to read? Yeah, Renee, go ahead.
Okay.
So this is the oven of Achnai. Excuse the pronunciation.
No, Achnai. It's Achnai.
Okay. What is Achnai? Said Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, that they surrounded it with words of debate, like an Achnai snake, and declared it impure. It was taught on that day. Eliezer.
Rebbe Eliezer. Yeah, it stands for rabbi. Yeah.
Rebbe Eliezer answered all the answers on earth, and they did not accept it from him. He said, if the law is like me, the carob tree will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 amah, some say 400 amah. They said, we do not bring proof from a carob tree. He went on and said, if the law is like me, the water channel will prove it. The water channel flowed in reverse direction. They said, "We do not bring proof from a water channel." He went on and said, "If the law is as I say, the walls of the house of study will prove it." The walls of the house of study inclined to fall. Rabbi Yehoshua protested at them, saying to them, "If scholars defeat each other in the law, how does it better you?" They did not fall because of the honor of Rabbi Yehoshua, and they did not straighten because of the honor of Rabbi Eliezer, and they still incline and stand.
Okay, the story continues from here, but does anybody have any early comments on sort of what we've read so far? I'll explain sort of one part of this story that's missing is the Achnai part. This was a particular question about an oven and about kashrut and sort of divisions if it's one oven, but if there are like walls in the oven, but what if there's a hole in the wall? So it sort of had to do with that. And it, Rabbi Eliezer came up with an answer, but it was not the majority answer. But he's saying, look, I know I'm right. And if I'm right, all these signs will appear, right? And they're like, oh, but the carob, it's a jumping carob tree. You would think that people would be, oh, well, that's out of the ordinary, right? Oh, but they're like, oh, no, we can't accept that. That doesn't prove anything, right? So it keeps going on and on. Anybody else have anything to reactions to what we've read so far?
I've
anything?
never liked this particular portion of Talmud.
No?
Because it seems that God is really backing Rabbi Yehuda. And
So,
the rest of the rabbis are saying, we don't care what God thinks.
Well, so we're gonna go. There's another yes. So maybe you know this the next what happens next in the story. So we'll go on, but I think this is a really nice way to sort of illustrate the Talmud and the storytelling form of the Talmud. So some of the things that you may notice are said Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, right? So we're already lots of name dropping that happens in the Talmud, and whose argument is whose, and here we have a storytelling element where someone is saying, look, I'm right, and I know I'm right. This is going to prove it. And there are all these sort of heavenly signs that say, yes, he's right. But they're all saying, no, 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 we can't accept that, right? So, and it also even has sort of a tangential argument here where it says that the walls were going to prove it. And then Rabbi Yehoshua protested at the walls. If scholars defeat each other in law, how does it better you, right? So the walls are like, okay, so we're not going to fall all the way. We'll just lean. So that tells you that we're proving a sign, but we don't want to be disrespectful to you, Rabbi Yehoshua, these inanimate walls, right? So there's a lot of, this is sort of a little indicative of the style. I'll go on to the next continuing page. So somebody want to read the second part?
I'll do it.
Okay, go ahead.
Rabbi Eliezer went and said, if the law is like me, from heaven they will prove it. A heavenly voice came out and said, what have you with Rabbi Eliezer, who the law is like him in every place? Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, the Torah is not in heaven. What does the Torah is not in heaven mean? Rabbi Yirmiyah said that the Torah was already given at Sinai. We do not pay attention to a heavenly voice, since you already wrote it at Sinai in the Torah after the majority to incline. Rabbi Natan met the prophet Elijah and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do in that hour? He said to him, God smiled and said, my sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me.
All right. So any reactions to what we're reading in this continuation of the story?
Baloney.
Yeah, that's actually, I mean, I have to say, that's a fair reaction because, like I said, it preserved all sides of the argument. In this case, it's saying, look, here's a guy who was right and everything proved him right. God agrees with him. But Lo bashamayim hi. This is not something for heaven to concern itself with, because God gave us the Torah and told us, run with this after the majority to incline, and appoint judges and officials and officers who are going to determine the halakha, right? So it's no longer in heaven's hands. It's no longer in the divine hands. It's on us as a society to determine how to interpret the law based on what was given at Sinai. So it's a really interesting instance where it's not even just who's wrong and who's right, but it's who's right but wrong and who's wrong but right. So it can get a little bit confusing. I just think this is a really interesting example of Talmud, and certainly also an example of the storytelling form, because you see a lot of sort of classic signs of storytelling, a lot of also classic signs of how the Talmud is told sort of in this story.
And
So if anyone doesn't have any further reactions or comments on this.
are you going to go a little farther with this, or can I make another comment?
Feel free.
And then they basically excommunicate Eliezer.
Yes, that is the next part of the story, and it gets a little tragic after that too. And there's like some sort of bad juju sort of that happens with that too, the excommunication, and yeah. So the story does go further from there. Thank you for pointing that out, Seth. And I think it's also supposed to illustrate to us the dangers of argument, and argument for argument's sake, or for being overly zealous in being right. So we have the majority, so you can't be right, even though, God says you're right. So look, you're going to be excommunicated because you're going to be problem for us, right? And then there's a lot of ill fortune that sort of befalls the people who are making that excommunication decision. So I think there is something to be learned, not just from the law or the story, but sort of the way people are treated, and the way we treat each other in circumstances like this when we don't agree. So I think that there is a lot to be learned from the story, even though it is, I mean, a jumping carob tree and the falling walls, and it's all, it can be a little bit
Don't forget
much.
the stream backing up.
Yes, the stream backing up, and a heavenly voice even say, so it is very what's the word? Outlandish, I guess. But it definitely does sort of get the point across. So we're going to move on. Discussion and workshop. So this is sort of the main component of this class. And we don't have a huge amount of time for it, but I want to sort of go into this. So perception of the storytelling and art form will depend on translation. So even I will say, even when operating within the original text form, so like with Hebrew, there are sometimes a variety of interpretations that could be made from the words. Sometimes anticipated words are even absent, and you sort of have to, or the way that something was written is not the way you would expect it to be written. So there's a lot of commentary because of things like that. And finding one's own words in translation can bring deeper and sometimes alternate meaning to the original text. So that's the end of the PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to basically, this next part of the class, break us up into groups in order to go through. Here, I'm going to put it in the chat again. This is the handout. One moment. Oh, wait, let me find it. Handout. There we go. So everyone should have a copy of this now. So even when we go into breakout rooms, you should still have a copy of this. Basically, I want you to take, let's see, maybe 7 or so minutes with your group to discuss either one or the other or both of the Psalms that are there for instances, like for examples of the Psalms. And what I did was the document has multiple translations. So really this exercise, if you actually want to give you a moment, if you want to grab a pen and paper, if you want to grab that, or if you want to type it up, you can do that too. But basically this part of the workshop, I think, is a really meaningful way of interpreting the Psalms. This is something that I've done a couple of times before. So basically the workshop is you're going to look at the text of the Psalms, and like I said, there's multiple translations, and I want you to go sort of line by line and kind of come up with your own interpretation of the words. Sometimes the text can be limiting. I'll share, for example, a lot of the texts and the ways that they're translated use masculine language, and that doesn't always resonate for me as a woman. So that's an example. Or sometimes there are sort of antiquated ways of relating to things that aren't the way we as modern people would relate to them. So there might be value in sort of bringing your own words to it. So the page, Renee, that we're looking at is going to be in the handout that I shared in the chat, which you can open the PDF. I'll share it on the screen too, so just to kind of give you a preview of what it's going to look like if you guys need to fetch your pen and paper. So I'm going to share what it looks like. One moment.
Cantor, do you want to
Yes.
keep recording, or do you want me to stop the recording?
No, we'll keep recording. I mean, it's going to stop the recording as soon as everyone goes into the breakout
Okay.
rooms. But I'm going to
Okay.
share for a second so people can see.
Okay.
I'm going to share the handout again so you can all see it. So the Psalms that we're looking at, like I said, well, when it comes to the workshop part of it, you won't have time to do both of them, but you can, for discussion's sake, you can certainly look at both of them if you want. So this is Psalm 32, and you see there's one translation here, and there's a second one here. And then there's also Psalm 9. It's a little bit longer. You might not have time to get through the whole thing in the time that we have, but like I said, you have a copy of the handout. So if you don't finish today and you want to look at it on your own, you can. And also, if you want to make it bigger, if it's hard to read, you can do that when it's on your own screen. So there are multiple translations of these. And then another option that's not what's in the handout is if you wanted to take some freestyle time and to come up with an acrostic of your own, you could also do that. But I would urge you, if you're going to do that, to maybe try to integrate some parallelism, or to try to integrate some spirituality and some Jewish elements into it if you're going to write an acrostic. So that's also an option for you. So let's see. I'm going to create breakout rooms here. One moment. Let's see. In a group this size, it probably makes sense to have no more than 2 breakout rooms. Let me ask you, maybe I'll ask an opinion before I do this. So do we want to have the breakout rooms? Do you want to choose which psalm you want to engage with first? Or do you want to just go through them, and whichever person is doing what, you can still share with other people, even if you're not doing the same one? Anybody have an opinion on that?
I'm fine with whatever easier for you.
Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to assign the breakout rooms here, and I'm going to name them. I'm going to let you choose the room. So room 1 is going to be for Psalm 9, and room 2 is, oh wait, actually it should be 3 breakout rooms, because if you wanted to do an acrostic, you could have that too. Add a room. Okay. Rename Psalm 32. And if you wanted to do acrostic, you could. So I'm going to open all the rooms right now, and take a look at what's in the does everybody have access to the handout? Can you all see the handout in the chat? You can open it. So I'll give you a moment if you want to take a quick look at it, and if you want to choose which breakout room to go in based on that. And that way, if there's a psalm that people don't want to engage with, then you don't have to choose it. So you can pick which room you're going to go in, and I'm gonna stop the recording now. I'll just record the wrap up part of the session too, just for good measure. Wait till everybody's back. Let's see. Is everybody back from the breakout rooms? Oh no, there's still a few people.
No, there's still some.
Okay, so we'll wait.
Back
And I mean, if any of you guys want to sort of start to share a little bit about sort of some of the meaningful points that you came to, does anybody want to share anything?
We took out the he's and hims.
Yeah, I do that too. And I'll say that I personally do that in prayer no matter what. I like to use no gender at all when I refer to God. So I say God and God's self. Sometimes I might slip up, but yeah, I find value in that, because it is kind of constraining sometimes to use all the masculine language with God. I agree.
We also noticed that when we were talking, Rabbi does that as well.
Yeah.
when because you can read something and we're reading it and he's saying it, it's different words because he'll take out the gender stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, and yeah, that was the he and the him was in the Sepharia version of Psalm 32. And in the Bible Hub version, which I had never heard of before, it wasn't that way at all. It was you and I, no he, him, no gender.
Uh-huh.
Is that a more recent interpretation, Cantor? Do you know Bible Hub as opposed to Sepharia?
Well, Bible Hub isn't a particularly Jewish. It actually has it includes the New Testament too, I think. But it has all the Old Testament, and it has Greek, and it has Latin, and it has, the Hebrew. So it's a very it's a nice resource sometimes, and it has many, many different versions of translations of things. And also it sometimes even has where you can sort of look at the Hebrew and parse it out sometimes too. So it's a useful resource that I like to use sometimes. But certainly I like to also refer to some of my books that I have, but I didn't feel like retyping them myself. So
Why not?
it's useful. It's useful to, especially for the longer Psalms. So it's useful to be able to just pull up translations. And if you do a Google search for Psalms, I'm sure you could find many different versions of translations. So I found this to be a really useful activity, though, like I said, because the translation and the interpretation is going to completely depend person to person. None of us necessarily experience life all the same way, or even the divine or spirituality or Judaism. I don't think there's any one way to be Jewish, right? So it's important to kind of keep that perspective in mind and find a way to live in the text a little bit that feels authentic to you, right? Because I think that's what it's all about. Let me see if we still have stragglers from the breakout rooms. Let's see. I thought I had closed them, but
It looks like everybody. Well, who's missing?
do we have everybody?
No, I think we have everybody.
Oh, we do. Okay. The breakout
Yeah,
room's still having people's names on them, but everybody's still here in
I
the main
think
session.
Kathy left just before we went into breakout rooms.
Okay, so I want to take a moment. So does anybody else want to share anything meaningful that you came across in your breakout rooms?
Yeah, I'll share from our group.
Mhm.
I really liked our group a lot and learned a lot. It was kind of transformational for me. I think, the 2 points I wrote down was that, well, for the first version, I think Renee mentioned that, there was a lot of destruction in the Psalm, and maybe to edit that portion down, but that we talked about sort of relating it to modern times, to the Ukraine, which actually made it really, really meaningful to all of us. And then Pilar ended our session with just, we didn't come up with the right words, but I would have loved just to use her words, with putting a line in there somewhere where to ask God to turn the hearts of our enemies away from destroying others. So take out some of the lines of destruction, relate it to something that's, that's difficult and meaningful to us right now, like what's going on in Ukraine, and then ending it with a line that actually says, please turn the hearts of our enemies around, so that everybody can just be nice to one another.
That's great.
And I'll just sort of share just something personally. When I was 11 years old, I remember, I remember going to my rabbi and saying this, Pilar, saying, Rabbi, why can't everyone just get along? I don't understand. We're still asking, I'm a lot older than 11 now, and we're still asking those same questions. So I liked the way Pilar came up with a nice way to end it.
Thank you. Yeah, why can't we all just get along?
Yeah, I'll also say that you remember how I mentioned earlier that Psalms, Tehillim, are recited during difficult times. You better bet there are plenty of people out there right now who are reciting Tehillim in light of what's happening in Ukraine. So it's really meaningful to make those connections. Yeah. If any of you want to see, I don't want to force anyone to share who doesn't want to, but I'll sort of show a personal example of here, I'm going to share the screen for a second. This is Psalm 27, which is often shared during the month of Elul and for the high holidays, right? A Psalm of David. The Lord is my light and my help. Whom should I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Whom should I dread? When evil men assail me to devour my flesh, it is they, my foes and my enemies, who stumble and fall. So that's an example of, a translation. And I'll share with you a personal translation I made a few years ago of Judaism. God is my light and my salvation. Why should I fear others? When a world of hate attempts to swallow my light into the darkness, they fail. If my enemies are on my doorstep, I will remain calm. If they wage war against me, I trust that I'll prevail. So, taking the lines and finding a way to, personally connect to them, I think is a really enriching way to experience Judaism and to experience what storytelling can do for us, because we are not just the beneficiaries of storytelling. We are storytellers ourselves. And how do we tell these stories to ourselves and pass them to generations and find ways to continually make them relevant and meaningful in our lives? So with that, I want to share one last psalm, which is at the psalm that is the last bit of your handout sheet, but I will share the screen again so you can see it. So one moment here, I'll share the screen. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to share a song, because this is one of the ways that we're meant to experience the Psalms. So I will share a really beautiful version of Psalm 148 by Nava Tehillah. And I encourage you, if you know it or if you are learning it, and to sing along and join me, though make sure you're on mute when you do so. So this is Psalm 140. And by the way, you'll see that there is definitely parallelism in this one. Very common. So. יהללו את שם אדוני, כי הוא ציווה ונברא, ויען מדין לעד לעולם, חוק נתן ולא יעבור. יהללו את שם אדוני, כי הוא ציווה ונברא, ויען מדין לעד לעולם, חוק נתן ולא יעבור. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining me for our session tonight. I hope you'll consider joining again as we sort of delve into the modern era, which is a very different sort of session from what we covered today. Some elements might be a little bit more familiar to you in terms of the modern era of storytelling and folk tales and the theater and lots of fun engagement with that. A little bit of Yiddish might come into that as well. So I hope you'll rejoin us then. And I hope you enjoyed our session tonight. And thank you for being here. Shavua Tov, everybody.
Hey, Cantor,
you, Cantor.
can I just say one thing? We all want to thank you so much too. This was a wonderful experience.
you.
I wasn't sure what to expect, but I learned so much. And just even seeing what you shared with us, how you reinterpreted that. I think that's something that we can all do, on our
Absolutely.
own too, but I really
By all
wanna
means, run
thank
with it. Absolutely. This is not
Yeah.
just mine. This is for anybody. So
It
yeah.
was really a wonderful session, and we really appreciate your time, and
Thank you.
we're looking forward to the 15th. So thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank
you for
you,
joining me.
Cantor. Thank you.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you, Cantor.
Hope to see you all next time.